Thank you for coming out to the Eat and Geek here at All Players. It's something that we do every single week on Thursday, where one person does a presentation over something that they geek out about. Today, for this week's Eat and Geek, I'm going to be talking about building jQuery widgets. Now, I did an Eat and Geek probably about a month ago, where I talked about JavaScript and building JavaScript, or basically JavaScript essentials. And this is going to be a lot different this week, because what I'm actually going to go through is doing and actually building a real-life jQuery product, which I really did not have time to really do for last week's Eat and Geek. But I really think the title should be Building Object-Oriented Services-Driven jQuery Mobile Widgets, which hopefully that makes you a little bit more excited about this presentation, because not only am I going to be going through like object-oriented JavaScript programming, but I'm also going to be talking about interacting with a real-life service. In this case, we're going to be interacting with the YouTube playlist API, and then also we're going to be using jQuery Mobile, which is essentially jQuery, but because we're using we're bringing in the jQuery Mobile stuff, it does list views for you, so that you can also compile it for something like PhoneGap, and you can actually put this into a real live, like a mobile application, which is probably a little bit out of scope of this Eat and Geek, but maybe for a future Eat and Geek, I can go into detail on how you could actually take what I'm about to build today and put that into a mobile device. Let me do a little bit of an intro. Since this is going to be a public video that I'm going to post on YouTube, my name is Travis Tidwell, and I work for All Players, and it is awesome. And as you can see, I've got all the devs from All Players sitting over here, so you might see them chit-chatting away over here, asking questions, doing all kinds of stuff. But pretty much the whole dev team is here, and we're all here to geek out. So for the code and demo of this presentation, yesterday I spent pretty much some time getting a real live website out that basically goes over what we're going to build. And I've also committed all of the code for this demo to github.com. My username is Travis T, and then YouTube_playlist. And so let me just show you what we're going to build. So if you actually go to that URL, what we're going to build today is this. So this is a jQuery mobile widget that uses the jQuery mobile. So you can see like all of these are jQuery mobile links. And what this is doing, this is actually pulling in a live feed from YouTube and displaying them in a list view. But I know that may sound pretty simple if you were to cowboy code this, but what I'd like to go through today is the proper way to actually create a good architecture so that you could build on top of something like this and create a really good architecture to build a widget, a jQuery widget. So with that said, I'm going to say a little line from Flight of the Conchords, and it's business time. So let's get to it. That wasn't funny? Thanks, Brooks. I appreciate it. So, I love the support from my fellow peers. So, if you actually go to that code base, you'll notice all of the files are filled out as far as like the JavaScript files. And then there's a source folder. There's also a YouTube playlist file that I have here. Basically, what I've done for this presentation is I've zeroed out everything. We are going to basically build this thing from scratch. I am going to keep the file structure just for sake of time, so that I don't have to go through and like create the files again. Inside the index file, what you'll notice is I'm bringing in some scripts. So I'm bringing in the source files that I just created. I'm also bringing in this YouTube playlist.js. Once I actually explain, get a little deeper, I'm going to go over why I separated these files. Essentially, these are going to basically be like classes, and I'll go into detail on that. And then you'll notice inside I have a body tag, and then all I've done is just created a div class and given it a class name. Now this is what you typically see whenever you do jQuery widgets. A lot of times what they'll do is say, okay, bind to some element and do something really cool with it. Well, what I wanted was to basically have that same concept where you bind to an element, but the actual widget literally builds the list view for you. so you don't have to worry about all of that markup to deal with. And so that's what our widget's going to do. It's going to take this div class, and we are going to build this playlist generated from YouTube inside of it. Another thing that you'll see very often is up here, you'll see a document ready, which basically means wait until the document is fully loaded, and then do something or create. So you select that div tag right here. So this is Jquery, and then you're going to do something called YouTube playlist, and then you're going to pass in the options. As of right now, this is kind of the magic thing that I'm going to go over on actually how to create your own one of these. So this is a pattern that I want everyone to take note of. Typically, whenever you have a Jquery widget, it works like this. You have some selector, and then you have some, I would say, widget name, and then you pass in an object of options. This is a pattern that you'll see that a lot of Jquery widgets do, and I recommend everyone that's building a Jquery widget do the same thing, just because it's a pattern that if you do it this way, people are just going to know how to use your widget. So with that said, let's make this thing come to life. Okay, so if I actually went to this page right now, you'll notice that it is empty. Let me see if I can go to it right here. So here it is. There's nothing here, nothing's happening because it's empty. I've basically zeroed out. In fact, it doesn't even know what the YouTube playlist is. So that's what I am going to use this YouTube playlist JS file for. So what I'm going to do is open this thing up. Now the very first thing that you're going to see whenever you actually build a Jquery widget is you're going to see them encapsulating the Jquery object. So a lot of times you'll see something that looks like this, or it goes function, and you'll see something like this, and then you'll see them pass in Jquery. So this is usually typically the very first thing that you see whenever somebody creates a widget for Jquery. And basically what this is doing is this is declaring an anonymous function, and it's calling it instantly with the Jquery global. And it's assigning that Jquery global to the variable $. This makes your script compatible for anybody, even if a script is using the $sign for something else. Your script will be able to work because this is now definitely associated with the Jquery global. So within here, we're actually going to do something to define this. So our next objective is to define this YouTube playlist within the JavaScript prototype. So to do that, you use $FN. Now what this is really just an alias for Jquery prototype, which is, if for those who watched my presentation last time, I talked about the prototype, and basically the best analogy that I could come up with a prototype is it's a blueprint. It is a way that if you were to reproduce this object, that blueprint would apply to all of the copies that you create. So what we're doing here is we are attaching some method to the Jquery prototype, and we name it the same thing that we name it here. So we're going to say there. And this is just a function, and it is a function that takes, remember our pattern here, it is a function that takes options. So I'm just going to say function options. And so now we've actually assigned this this method to the Jquery prototype. The next thing that you'll notice that most widgets do is they will return a $this each, and I'm going to go over what this is. Now, this is also really important. We must return a pointer to ourself, and the reason why we have to do this. So I mean, I could actually just do this. I could just return the Jquery object of myself. Okay, so whenever you do this, the Jquery assigns the this pointer to the actual context that you're within, which in this case is this div tag. The problem is if Jquery is known for its chaining mechanisms. So if I were to say YouTube playlist, and I would say period hide right here, that's what Jquery is known for. It's known to be able to chain commands one right after the other. And in order for that to work, you must always return the pointer to itself, always. And because otherwise, if you don't return anything, that at the end is going to be null, and you're basically going to call hide on a null object, which would cause an error. So that's why we return something. The next thing you're going to notice is that they say period each, and they iterate over something. Now the each inside jQuery, what that basically means is iterate over something. Now what are we iterating over? Keep in mind that whenever you actually declare a jQuery object, you declare it with a selector. Okay, so I have selector YouTube playlist, and I'm using a class here, so it is actually legal for me to do this, to create two of these. So now what happens? Okay, so we have two different objects, and this is actually perfectly legal. And in jQuery, when you do this, you basically say, I want to apply this business logic to all of these items that are in this selector. Well, that's what the each is for. The each basically applies your business logic to each one of these. Okay, so whenever you see that, you are basically making your widget able to handle multiple instances on the page. Okay, so that's what the each is for. So now we're actually going to get into the guts and glory of this thing. Okay, and a lot of times what you'll see in jQuery widgets is you will see like thousands of lines within this. You'll see a bunch of code of people doing some crazy stuff. But what I'm going to do is something different. In fact, it's a pattern that I've started using just because I feel it's more expandable, and that is to make the actual jQuery part of it as minimal as you can possibly make it, and then actually contain the business logic within separate classes. So that's what we're going to do. So to do that, what we're going to do here is we're going to first... So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, in here I'm going to say new, and I haven't created this yet, YouTube playlist, and I'm going to pass in the context and the options. Now I haven't actually created this yet, but I'll explain what I'm doing here. And really this is all that you need to do. And really I know a lot of you are saying, okay, you're creating a new object, but you're not assigning it to anything. And this is also something else that I do is I will attach the object to the actual DOM element. And at this point, the DOM element is defined by the this pointer. So right here, I'll say, okay, I'll say this YouTube playlist equals new YouTube playlist. And what's cool about this is now I can actually check for it. So if this doesn't already exist, create it only if it doesn't exist, okay? And if it does exist, you can actually do an else statement here to actually do like an update. So let's say that they want to update the options of their widget. You could actually say, we could do like some method here and pass in the options, but we'll do that later. So okay, so here's typically all of my jQuery layer, okay? I've attached an object to the DOM element. And what I've done is I'm creating a new class that we haven't built yet, and I'm passing the context into that class with the options that they provide. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend most of my time actually building this out and showing you the right way to do this. And so this is a big reason why I've split my files out between like YouTube display, YouTube playlist, and then YouTube teaser, is because this namespacing helps keep everything separated and also helps you organize it. So here, YouTube playlist, we're going to be inside the YouTube playlist.js file. So here we are. We have a blank JavaScript file. Okay. The very first thing that I'm going to do is establish a namespace. And you could actually create JavaScript widgets by just creating like playlist, you know, context, options. You could do something like this. The problem is when you do this, you're not really within a namespace, and this could end up getting clobbered if somebody else declares with the same thing. This is why I like using namespaces, is because you are basically saying, it's kind of like the jQuery global, you're saying all of my functionality resides within this namespace. And the namespace that I'm picking right now is called YouTube, which actually that's probably a bad namespace because I'm sure somebody out there has created a YouTube widget. So I'd probably call it like YouTube _playlist. Regardless, let's establish our namespace. And to do that, you're going to say var playlist, or YouTube, I'm sorry, is equal to YouTube or nothing. Okay? This is what you'll see a lot at the top of my functions. And what this is doing, this is basically saying, okay, I want to create a namespace unless it's already created. So if it's already created, it'll just use the existing namespace. Otherwise, it's going to create a new one. From this point, you actually have access to this YouTube object. So I could say YouTube playlist equals function. And it takes two arguments. One is a context, the context that for the this pointer, and the second is the options. Okay? So now here's the cool thing about this. So now I actually have a class, and using this same pattern, I can apply that to all my other existing classes and put them in separate files. And just because I'm loading them in my index.html file, it's going to bring in that functionality, and they're not going to clobber each other. They're going to work very well with each other. So this is a good pattern that everyone can follow. So now here we are. I have a class. The very first argument is context. The second one is options. You can see that by me passing it right here. So here I am creating a new playlist. I'm passing in the context, which is just this right here would actually end up pointing to this element, the div YouTube playlist. So I've got a context, and then I have some options. This is the point where you could, if you wanted to, you could build out all of this business logic behind playlist. So here's the problem, and you could actually do that, but you would probably end up going down this path anyway. I always like to have a base class that handles the context and the options separately. And I'll show you the reason why whenever I build that out. So what I would like to do is create a base class in which playlist derives from, but also whenever I build out the teaser, it will derive from display as well, so that my base class can do functionality that I don't have to replicate in both of these classes when I build them out. Okay, so what I would like to end up doing is doing something like this, where I say YouTube display, and then I'm going to basically call that with the context and options. So this is going to be the base class, which I'm going to define in here, and it is going to take these two options. Okay, and also this is something I went over in my last JavaScript presentation. Was there is some boilerplate code you have to write here if you want to derive from a class, and that is as follows. So you say YouTube playlist prototype, and you're going to say equals new YouTube display, and then you say YouTube playlist prototype constructor, and you have to reset the constructor back to playlist. I don't really expect you to understand what this is doing. Just remember that this right here, whenever you see this anywhere, this is boilerplate code that basically makes YouTube playlist derive from YouTube display. So here's where we start getting into the object-oriented part of this. I now have a class, and I want that to call a base display class. Okay? So let's go over to the YouTube display, and let's build this thing out. So the very first thing I do is establish my namespace. If I could type, that'd be awesome. And really a lot of this is just going to be copy and paste. So I'm just going to just copy this. Actually, so I'll say YouTube display equals function. It takes two variables, context and options, and then we're there. So now because YouTube display doesn't derive from anything, I don't have to do that derivation code here. But here's one thing I am going to mention, and this is a gotcha when you're dealing especially with derivations, is you'll notice whenever I go over to YouTube playlist, I'm actually doing a new YouTube display here, and I'm not passing any arguments. This is a gotcha. And a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll put business logic inside of their constructors, and and they'll do something like, you know, console log, or, you know, options, and they'll have like some title or something, and that right there will cause an error. And the reason is because options is nothing whenever you're doing derivation. So what I always do is this is the reason why I always have a base class. The base class handles context and makes sure that we are not just being declared to extend the prototype, but rather this is a real object with context. And to do that, I always will say if context and context length is greater than 0, then I call like some init function. So I'll say like this init. Okay. Now I actually have to build this init function, so I'm going to do that right now. So YouTube display prototype, because we're dealing with the blueprint, and I went over this prototype in my last presentation. So this init equals function, and then what I typically like to do here is then pass in the options, okay, and then I'll assign that to this an actual variable attached to this object. So this options equals options. Okay. So now here's what's cool about this. So what I'm going to do is just say console log this options, just so we can watch this thing. Okay. So I have this init. It's only going to happen whenever we have a context, and then on this YouTube playlist, so this calls that. I'm just making sure everything's right before I run this thing. Does YouTube playlist, that looks good. This option. So now if I refresh this, you should, let's see, element scripts. We're going to see what this is doing. So context at first is nothing. The second context is something. You see it's, oh, look, I have them in the wrong order. So context is actually showing my options, so I did something wrong here. Let's see what I did wrong. I bet I know what it is. Context options. To playlist. Options. What did I do wrong? Oh, I am. Oh, it's working. I'm logging the. No, wait a second. No, I'm not. Why is? You always have to debug. Okay, so here's our context. That looks right. The options looks good. Oh, I know what I did. So call is squirrely. When you say call, what you really have to do is you have to call it with your this pointer. Okay, you have to call it and establish your saying, hey, I want to call this function as me. So anytime you do call, you must use the this pointer. So that might be that's another gotcha that you guys are gonna have to remember when you do derivation. You have to say call this context options. So that should now print out my object, which it does. Okay, so we're on a roll now. And I'm glad you guys got to see me debug that, because that's something that you guys definitely need to take note of, that is a gotcha. Okay, so let's move on. Now that I have an init function, I can easily derive from that init function within my playlist class. So I don't really have to do anything. My base class is doing all the heavy lifting for me. So prototype, init, and we need to derive from the base class, which is YouTube display, prototype, init. We have to call the base class first, and then now in here I can do some really cool stuff. For example, I can get I now have access to console log options right here. So now I'm going to take out the one from the base class, and I'm going to have it inside the playlist now. So now if I refresh, you should see that my my playlist class options, this options, and really it really should be this, because that init takes the options class, but that's fine. We can use this options. This. You have to make sure you pass your variables to your super class. That's real important. So now I have this thing. Before I actually do anything with these options, let me cover another use case that you're going to definitely have to handle, which is how do I, within my widget, provide default options. So let's say they don't provide a playlist. I still want the playlist to be there, but I want it to be defaulted to something. To do that, you always do that within the constructor. Okay, so like right here, and you type this code that looks like the following. You say options equals jQuery extend. You provide your defaults here, and you pass in options here. Okay, so I would say playlist something width. I'm going to make my default 300 pixels. So this is how you provide defaults. Here's what's really cool about this. You only need to provide the default options that you care about within this class. Because because you're going to be passing around your options for every object you create, let the other classes provide defaults that they care about. And so this is a really cool way to kind of spread out your defaults being spread amongst all the other classes. So we're going to be using that as well. So using the defaults. Okay, so now that I have that, let's actually do something with this. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a jQuery JSON, I think it's get JSON. And then it's going to be this options playlist. And I think you guys are going to really like this on how easy this really is. Console log. What I'm actually doing, so here's the cool thing. I'm providing the playlist here inside the options, okay? That is getting passed to here, which is then getting passed to my base class. My base class is making sure that we are in context. It calls init with the options, which sets this, but because it's object-oriented, my init function gets called as well, and then I'm going to do a jQuery JSON get playlist, and I'm going to load it. So let's actually see what happens here. So it's going. You might look at network to see it actually did it should have done a load, and I've got an object back, and check this out. This is the actual feed from YouTube. So this object right here shows the feed that I'm getting from YouTube in object form, which is really, really cool, and it's amazing that it's that easy. So now, what do we want to do with this now? So our objective was to take that feed and populate it in an actual HTML list here. Okay? So at some point we need to actually print out markup, okay, that will actually contain that playlist. So I'm going to do that right now. And we're also going to use the display class to help us here. So a lot of times what I do is inside the display class, I will basically create another function called create. So I'll say this context, and it will return the context of this class, so that every class can provide their own context. And as I do this, you'll see what I mean. So I'm going to create this create, and I'm going to pass in the context here. Okay? So now what I'm going to do is create that method. So YouTube, display, prototype, create, and it's going to get the context. Now keep in mind, what is this context at this point? I've never changed it, so the context is still pointing to this div tag. What I want is every single object that I create to point to their own context. Meaning, what I would like to have is have like UL and then LI. You know, you guys know this. And I want the playlist to point to the UL, and I want each teaser to basically be its own LI element. And you want their context to point to the right context. And so that's why it's important to create do this create method. And the display, because he doesn't really care about context, he's just going to return context here. and say context equals context, and so that will actually set the context variable. Where this becomes powerful is when you override it, which we're going to do right here. We're going to do that in the playlist. I always get that wrong. I'm going to close that. So here I am. I'm going to put it up here, and we are going to this playlist, and actually I'm going to go ahead and copy this because I still want to call the create. Call. Okay, and I want to replace it with, so then I can say context equals. So now what I'm doing here is I'm making sure that my super class gets called first, and then I'm returning the context. What's awesome about this is I've got full control of what's inside here, including creating a UL element. So I'm going to do that right now. So I'm going to say, the way I like to do it is using jQuery document create element. Okay. Now, what this actually is doing is document create element is actually a just regular JavaScript function, and because I'm wrapping that in jQuery, jQuery is now a managed jQuery object, and I can actually assign my context. I could actually even return that, and it will return. Oh, wait a second, I don't want to do that. I can say var display equals. So now I'm creating, my element is now in that display, and then I can say context append display, and then return the context. And actually, you want to return your context. So now, because I'm returning my context, this object's context variable is assigned to that UL element. So you'll actually see what happens here. This should create, it created an UL element here. So this guy right now, he has just created a UL element. He has attached himself to the display. So you see how this object-oriented, you can really create some really cool encapsulation where each class only cares about the elements that define them, and any child classes will define their other stuff, which I'll show you when I get into the teasers. So one thing I do need to add here, and I'm going to have to refer to my code up here, which is, if I go to playlist, to do jQuery mobile, to do a list view, I have to do this attribute, and this is another reason why. So I'll show you what this is basically doing. So the reason why I like using jQuery UL is because you can easily attach attributes to the UL element. And then also you'll notice what I'm doing here is because this takes a width, I can now set the width of my display based on the options here. And so now whenever I refresh, you'll see that those attributes will get added to this UL, the UL tag. Unless it throws an error. Width of undefined. So what did I do wrong here? It probably needs to be attached first. What did I do here? No. It's the exact same thing, didn't it? I did something wrong. Oh, I probably had a parentheses in the wrong spot. Undefined. This options. Oh, I haven't created my options yet. Well, we can do this. Hang on. The options is defined down here, so I can just say this context width, this options width. That should work. Okay, so now you see I've attached some things to this thing. So I've attached some attributes. Now that I've got the display for my playlist, let's actually do something with it. Let's get inside this data tag. So here I'm logging the data, and you'll notice this is what I'm getting back from YouTube. So if we actually investigate this, the playlist part is inside entry, and inside each one of these you will see like app, author, you'll see all the metadata that you need to get. So for sake of time, what I'm going to do is copy and paste I'm going to copy and paste this, and I'll just kind of explain it on what it's doing. But just so that you guys know, what this is doing is building the playlist. So I did have to create a closure here, which I explained in my last presentation, which the closure basically allows me to encapsulate the this pointer so that I can use it inside, like for example, like right here, playlist context list view. So with this data, what I'm doing is I'm iterating over the data feed entry. So if you actually look at the browser here, I'm iterating over data feed entry, and I'm just iterating over these things. Okay, there's 25 of them. Inside here, I'm actually assigning a variable called item, and I'm assigning it to that. So item is now going to point to this object. And in here, what I'm doing, you guys will like this, instead of doing some crazy stuff with teasery stuff, I'm allocating a separate class to handle that for me, which we're going to build next, which is going to be called new YouTube teaser. I pass in the playlist context, which is the context we're in right now, as well as some options. And the options that teaser is going to take is going to be title, description, thumbnail, link. Okay? So that's all I'm doing is creating a new class. And then at the very end, I'm calling playlist context list view, and I'm doing a refresh. Okay? That's it. That is our playlist. Let's build this teaser out. Create the namespace for YouTube teaser context options. This is a pattern that you guys just remember.
Travis, is it okay if I ask a question real
Yep.
quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
YouTube equals YouTube or nothing. To me, that's a Boolean expression.
It's this is a conditional in JavaScript.
Okay.
So this is the same thing as saying YouTube. It's shorthanded. It's actually faster of saying YouTube. That.
Okay.
It's the same thing except YouTube. I mean, except JavaScript. This is actually faster. It's a faster conditional.
Coming from PHP world, I would have said that was
a bug.
equal to true
right.
or false.
Yep.
So.
Nope. In JavaScript, it's going to pick one or the other.
That's cool.
Yeah, because it'll evaluate this as being true or false, and if not, then it'll assign it to either one. So that's a Douglas Crockford thing.
Cool.
So the teaser, here's where I love deriving from a base class. I'm going to derive from display. So once you have the like the framework in place, it's real easy just to go through and copy and paste. So all of this is so most of this is just boilerplate code. Now you noticed in my playlist I'm passing different options: title, description, thumbnail, link. So what I'm going to do is copy these, and I'm going to provide default. Now it's really good practice for everyone, for whatever options you accept to for whatever options your class accepts, to always put it inside the defaults. Because the reason is because then you can document it. And so now if I'm opening up your widget, I can look at this right here and know what options your widget accepts without having to dig through the code and find it myself. So like a really good practice would be to add some like comments that say this is the title, to comment each option, so that way if I was to open this up, I would know immediately that you accept the title, description, thumbnail, link. Okay? So what are we going to do? We are going to override a couple of functions. The first one is going to be YouTube teaser. Well, I will just copy. Let me just copy. It's faster. So we're going to use these two functions, except it's going to be teaser, not playlist. We're still we are still going to derive from the base class. So here's what's really cool about this. It's passing in the context of the playlist. So at this point, playlist context, because we established it up here, or up, where is it? Up here. playlist context points to the UL element. So at this point in this teaser, this context is going to point to the UL element. So what we need to do is we need to append new LI elements. What I typically like to do in my classes, just because it makes it easier to manage and it's also faster, is to use this same pattern, which is this document create element right here, but assign that to variables attached to the class. And I'll show you that right now. So I'm going to create elements for title, description, thumbnail, link. So I'm going to say this title, that is an H3 element. This description, that is going to be a page element. This thumbnail, and you'll see how this is much cleaner than just doing markup inside of JavaScript, because you can also assign variables, which you'll see where that becomes really handy later. And then I have this link equals Jquery, and that's going to be an anchor tag. So now at this point, all I need to do is decide what my final markup should look like, which I've already got markup here just to kind of show you. So let's look at this markup. So it looks like I've got well, actually this kind of Jquery Mobile adds some stuff to this, so we're gonna have to kind of get around that. But the anchor tag is first, and inside that we have the image, H3, and then page. So the first thing we need to do is create an LI element. So that's going to be the display. So I'm going to say var display equals LI. Okay. And I'm going to return the display. So that's why I like doing this, is because I am predefining what variable is assigned to which element. I now don't have to worry about, like, I always get confused in jQuery when you start doing like append and do all this stuff of like, okay, now what does my variable point to now? If you do it like this, you will always know. You will never forget what variable your stuff is pointing to. So now at this point it becomes real easy. Watch this. I just say display. I want to append the link. Okay. Oh, this link. Now, so I've just appended the link. Inside, now I want to append the image inside of that, so then in here I say append this thumbnail, and it looks like thumbnail has a sibling that's title, so now I say append title, append description. So this is a very cool programmatic way of building markup that I recommend everyone doing. And then now I have to add that to the context. So I say context append display, and then return the display. And now whenever I refresh, you will see, hopefully, I've written a lot of code since then. You'll see it's already done something. Let's see what this markup looks like. And it looks like it's going to be right. So we have A. See how cool is that? All my markup looks beautiful. And not only that, but now I know my context is always pointing. My context is pointing to LI because that's what I'm returning here. Awesome. Now what's missing? What's missing is I need to attach data. Because I created variables, this becomes super simple. In fact, I do it right here. I say this title text equals this options title, this description text equals this options description, this image, or it's actually thumbnail. Now thumbnail it's not text, you actually have to set an attribute, but it's easy. Attribute source options thumbnail. And this link, I just have to set the href on that. Href, this options link. Because I have all my variables separated, literally my widget becomes that easy. Super, super simple. And that is my teaser. Let me make sure that I didn't make a spelling error. I typically when I'm doing this, I wouldn't spell it out. I would just copy and paste just to make sure that. I think it's going to look good. Let's see. And if not, we can debug it. And there you go. Look at that. That's how easy it is whenever you actually have like really good business logic. So you see it populated the source tag. I got my H3 heading, my page. And then what's cool about this is because I'm using jQuery Mobile, I guess I didn't spend as much time as I wanted to on jQuery Mobile. Really all jQuery Mobile does is you add this list view data role. You add a theme. And then down here you say, on the context of the playlist, you just give it a list view. You just declare it as list view. Here's another thing that's really cool. Because I've got this thing architected well, if I wanted to pass in new options, I could just say init options and pass in. So now if I go over to my widget, I could say right here, else this, if it's already defined, YouTube playlist init options to assign new options. What's cool about that is, let's say at some point I wanted to load a new playlist. All I would have to do in my index file is do this again, YouTube, and pass in a different playlist. And it would just dynamically load it, which is awesome. And that actually works really well. Because the object already exists in the DOM element, instead of actually creating a new one, I'm just saying init it with new options. And then that right here, it'll go in here, and it will do a new JSON, get JSON. You might need to do like a clear here. So like I would probably want to do like a, like right here, I'd probably want to say this context empty, which would empty out your context. Actually, it would be playlist context because this pointer is not what I expect. So actually, that's what you want it to be. You want it to empty its context, then it'll rebuild, and so then you could actually call it with a new playlist. It'll reload, so you could do like pagination this way. You could, because the YouTube API allows for pagination. So that's it, guys. That is a jQuery mobile widget, completely 100% object-oriented. And you can look right here. I mean, for what this does, the code is not that difficult. It's all architecture. So that's it. I'm opening up for questions. Anyone? Nothing? You guys just...
Yeah, I have one, Travis.
Yeah.
So before you would actually publish a plugin like this, would you move all of those classes into the same file as the actual plugin?
Yeah, so typically what I do, in fact, I have on a lot of my, and I'm not saying I do it the best way, but if you actually look at a lot of classes that I build, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like MinPlayer is good, but it's pretty complex. Like tree select, I do it. So what you'll see is I actually create a make file, and a make file, what it does is you'll see I provide the files, and I do like a JS lint, so I'll lint them to make sure my lint is good, and then I'll do like a compression right here, so like compiler. So what this does is this will actually compress it into a compressed version of it, and I just have a make that does that, and I put those in a bin folder. And so these right here, so anytime before I commit, I say make, it'll make all my files, it'll lint it so I know if I have any errors, and it'll create a compressed version, so like right here, and it'll create a uncompressed version right here, which is basically all of my classes put into one file. But my source, I always keep separate. Does that make sense? I'll take
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Cool. All right. Any other questions? That was like right around an hour. I think it's a pretty sweet widget for just an hour of developing and also walking through.
Boy, awesome.
Anybody else? All right, guys. Thanks a bunch. I will post this on YouTube so you guys can watch it again if you guys have, if you want to try and reproduce it, or hey, go clone my my branch and add to it. You guys, I mean, if you guys want to, I pretty much have made this a, you know, you guys can do what you want with it. Thanks a bunch, guys.